A pioneer, Elizabeth Cady
Elizabeth
Stanton.
Stanton grew up in a privileged family where she became used to a luxurious life. Later in life, she married Henry Brewster Stanton, and together they had 7 children. The role of a mother and caretaker quickly overtook Stanton's life as she was not prepared for the role of rural housewife. She was overworked, bored, lonely, depressed, and from this she became aware of the woman's subordinate status in American society, thus began her fight for women's rights. On her journey, she became best friends with Susan B. Anthony, who was also a women's activist. Together, Anthony and Stanton made significant changes throughout the course of women's history.
Before Stanton took action to make change within American society, women were expected to be dependent on men as they were overlooked and immediately pushed to the side to partake in household activities. Women were not allowed to vote, own property, or even partake in politics. A marriage was basically a way for a man to own his wife as his property. They were left powerless and isolated from the world as their husband was their only connection to the world outside the home.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of the first people to create a welcoming environment for all women to express themselves freely, as Stanton fought for their rights by questioning authority through her literary works. Despite receiving extreme hatred, she persevered, ultimately establishing herself as a pioneer on the frontier of women's rights.
As Stanton began to progress her movements, she sought to create a welcoming environment where women could express themselves freely as they fought together for their rights.
In order to gain support and participation from other activists, Stanton took her first big step on her journey, creating a place for women to come together and share their ideas, progressing all women towards a brighter future in women's equality. On July 19th to July 20th, 1848, the famous Seneca Falls Convention took place, known as the First Women's Rights Convention. Even though the women of New York were only given 5 days' notice and a mere announcement in a paper without any signatures of who would be in attendance, the women of New York still showed up in great numbers. The Seneca Falls Convention was a call to action that brought together hundreds of women, each of which held different views, experiences, and voices. Resulting in a huge success, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other leaders of the convention developed hope for women's equality in the future.
After gaining traction, the women's rights movement took off with women across the country joining the fight for equal rights. Stanton was a talented writer, and with the help of her partner Susan B. Anthony, they were able to successfully create the newspaper The Revolution. Created and edited by women, the newspaper was a resource for women to learn about new advancements in the world of women's politics and social life. The Revolution was one of the first newspapers to discuss topics that some men in the current time period viewed as inappropriate, such as divorce, rape, women's role in the home, and voting, all of which highlighted the free speech of women. The revolution fostered an environment where women's voices were heard in a newspaper solely dedicated to women's rights.
By 1869, the black males that Stanton, Anthony, and others had spent many years working beside had finally achieved their goal through the 15th Amendment when they gained the right to vote. But Stanton and the other women's rights leaders were still far from their goal of women's equality. Stanton split from the suffrage movement and began to solely focus on women's equality through the creation of the National Woman Suffrage Association in late 1869. The National Woman Suffrage Association connected women who were determined to achieve their right to vote. As the first association to solely focus on women's rights to vote, it was able to create a safe environment for women to express their opinions on women voting without feeling pressured to also fight for other problems at the time.
As a pioneer on the frontier of women's rights, Stanton constructed a safe community for women and enabled them to create a larger impact on their nation.
Stanton made clear her position as an influential leader as she questioned authority through her literary works.
During the Seneca Falls Convention, Stanton created the Declaration of Sentiments, a take on the Declaration of Independence but incorporating women into the contract. The Declaration ended up receiving 100 signatures, 32 men and 68 women. An important message from the sentiments said, "We declare our faith in the principles of self-government. We ask no special favors. We ask justice. We ask equality. We ask that all civil and political rights that belong to the citizens of the United States be granted to us and our daughters forever." End quote. She fought for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all women in the United States as she continued to further herself as a pioneer of women's equality.
As Stanton furthered women's suffrage, their rights began to become a primary focus within the U.S. Stanton used her talented and resourceful writing skills to create a petition for the House of Representatives. She wrote, "The Constitution classes us as free people, and counts us whole persons in the basis of representation, and yet are we governed without our consent, compelled to pay taxes without appeal, and punished for violations of law without choice of judge or juror. End quote. In this petition, Stanton highlights already existing amendments to prove how the U.S. is not currently obeying their own laws. Stanton depicted herself as a pioneer by sending this controversial petition to the House of Representatives, as there was a high possibility that the petition could damage the public's view of the women's rights movement. However, she was willing to take this risk if it meant a step closer to women's equality.
In 1895, Stanton continued to progress her stance by publishing the Woman's Bible, a new Bible inspired by the original Bible's misrepresentation and underrepresentation of women. Therefore, she took matters into her own hands to make sure all women felt equal under the eyes of God. The Woman's Bible held the purpose to dismiss the idea that woman was made after man. The Bible was one of the obstacles which stood between them and the full enjoyment of their human rights. As a pioneer of her time period, Stanton's questioning of the original Bible was a bold and controversial stance due to the fact that most people's ideals and goals were shaped by the Bible. In order for Stanton's voice to be heard, she knew including the freedoms of women in the Woman's Bible would create a significant impact on gender stereotypes.
Stanton's talented writing reflected her domination of the literature frontier as well as portrayed her as an influential writer.
Stanton's perseverance through the criticism and hate encouraged her to further progress the women's rights movement.
The Seneca Falls Convention was the first time Stanton had to deal with extreme hate. Because it was the first ever women's convention, new ideas and beliefs were addressed that had never been heard before, and therefore most people did not support the convention. Following the meeting, Stanton described that all the journals from Maine to Texas seemed to strive with each other to see which could make their movement appear the most ridiculous. But they had set the ball in motion, and now in quick succession conventions were held in Ohio, Indiana, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and in the city of New York, and have kept up ever since. End quote. The public's weak support and misrepresentation of the true purpose ended up calling more attention to Stanton's cause. The hate encouraged her to fight harder and persevere to make the frontier of women's right louder and stronger.
Originally, Frederick Douglass was a supporter of Stanton's movement. However, as time progressed, he clearly advocated that a black man should gain the right to vote before a woman, beginning their feud. Douglass was insulted by Stanton and Anthony's lack of support for his fight and no longer supported their cause. After many debates, their friendship was split, casting a bad light on Stanton and Anthony. Clearly, during this time, white supremacy overpowered society, and the fight for African Americans was needed. After losing Douglass's support, the public began to develop the wrong message that Stanton and Anthony were racist. However, Stanton's discouragement from Frederick Douglass inspired her to create the first National Women's Suffrage Association, where women's voting would be the main and sole priority.
As previously mentioned, Stanton published the Woman's Bible, a spin on the traditional Bible that focuses on painting women for who they truly are and giving them a place in religion. On March 3rd of 1895, Stanton began gathering members to join the revising committee for her new Bible. At first, two of her friends and respected women's rights activists agreed, but then quickly withdrew their names as they feared the work would be too radical. The idea of a women's Bible was daunting to many people during this time period because it was new, unique, and had never been done before. Yet this didn't discourage Stanton. She continued her search to find dedicated women, and once she did, they successfully published the Woman's Bible. The publication attracted much attention, good and bad. One hater stated, "It is the work of woman and the devil." End quote. However, despite rude comments, it was still well known across the nation due to Stanton's perseverance.
It takes a strong pioneer to take the hate of others and empower it into a greater cause, yet Stanton proudly took this honor.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton took great leaps forward to establish herself as a monumental figure in the women's rights movement through the creation of a comfortable environment to empower women to fight for their freedom alongside Stanton as she continued to question authority through her literary works. Although Elizabeth Cady Stanton received extreme criticism throughout all her endeavors, she persevered, ultimately establishing herself as a pioneer on the frontier of women's rights.
Even though Elizabeth Cady Stanton died before the 19th Amendment was ratified, her efforts for the women's rights movement throughout her life made the 19th Amendment possible. The U.S. Constitution states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." End quote. Today, women around the U.S. continue to fight for their rights as new laws against women are passed. Specifically, abortion has become one of the most controversial topics regarding women's rights, as today abortion is banned in 11 states, limiting women from having control over their own body. Marches and protests across the United States continue to surface as women fight for their justice.